Hey, everybody. When Fred Rivera was just a kid growing up in Southern California, his grandpa put him to work in his landscaping business. And it was that work, mowing lawns and putting in sweat equity, that taught Fred what paying his dues was all about. Fred would chase his baseball dreams. And although he never made it to the major leagues as a player, he did go to law school and then make it to the majors as the general counsel of the Seattle Mariners. This week, Fred shares his story, which was inspired in part by seeing a Latino attorney on the hit show LA Law back when he was just a kid, and the places it took him play out like a Hollywood script. So let's get to the story of business and baseball with Fred Rivera. Well, this is good because it's business and sports, two of my loves, and that's kind of in your career too, so it's fun to connect with you.
Yes, absolutely.
You have a long resume, and I want to get to these great positions you've had, working in DC, managing director, partner of a large law firm, obviously big position with the Mariners. But before all that, right, from what I understand in looking at your history, you weren't exactly a silver spooner, if you will, right?
That's right.
So growing up north of LA, give us what was that like for you?
Well, I was born in Santa Monica, California, from a family that actually migrated there, starting in the 1930s. My grandparents migrated to Santa Monica, of all places, which was a different Santa Monica than it is today. And my parents were young. They were 18 when I was born. We moved around quite a bit in the Los Angeles area and eventually settled in community now known as the Santa Clarita Valley. It's called Canyon Country when I went there. Lived there for about 7 years, going through high school there. Baseball was a big part, and I'm sure we'll get into sports as we move through this. Baseball was a big part of my life growing up. It was the constant as our family was moving, and I went to a number of elementary schools before we ended up in Canyon Country. So it was really a stabilizing force and became my passion as I grew up. But I was not a silver spooner. Blue collar family. Spent a lot of time with my grandparents, my maternal grandparents in particular. Spent a lot of time with my grandfather, who was a gardener. And in hindsight, as I think about it, he was an early entrepreneur. He was born in Mexico and came over with his family, was a migrant farm worker as early as 11 and 12 years old, and started assisting with somebody as a gardener mowing lawns, and eventually took off in his own business, and created a really nice business, a nice income to support his family over the years.
Mm-hmm. And what did you learn from your grandparents by observing them, I guess?
Well, I think in general it was hard work. They were hard workers. My grandmother was a housekeeper, assistant in house. She had a number of odd jobs. Also stayed home with her 3 kids, including my mother. Hard work, number one, I think, is something that I learned. But I think I've learned over the years something that they said and others have said, it's not unique to me, is you got to see to be, right? You really have to see what you want to be, aspire to be, want to attain, whether it's professional or personal, in order to have an opportunity to reach that goal. And what I saw with them was not only their hard work and what they had attained, but also them promoting me as being able to do something even beyond what they had done. And I remember working with my grandfather, and that I loved that. I'd go out with his truck, right, and sometimes my mom would let me miss school, and I'd go run the routes and mow lawns, and just had a great time. As this is 11, 12 years old even. And he would mow lawns at these beautiful homes in Pacific Palisades and Beverly Hills, and saying, "Hey, I really want to do what you're doing when I grow up." And he said, "No, I want you to live in one of these homes that I'm mowing the lawn when you grow up. So really it was them pushing me and them showing me that there was something beyond what the limits they had in their career and opportunities.
Yeah, that's a great story. That was a great story. And what about your grandma? Was she influential in
She
your
was.
upbringing? Yeah.
Yeah, she really was in a number of different ways, including baseball. She was a passionate baseball, and she would
Mhm.
say she had three passions. She loved baseball, the game in general. She loved the Dodgers, huge LA Dodger fan. In fact, she had stacks of newspapers after she passed that she kept at the LA Times when they moved to LA. From she went to the games in the Coliseum and she had newspapers of the Dodger Stadium, Chavez Ravine being built. And so very passionate Dodger fan. And she passed that on to me and the love of baseball. Her third passion was hating the San Francisco Giants.
Yeah,
So
that goes with it. Yeah.
that goes with it. So in those three ways, she passed on those passions on to me. Although I've as a greater writ large baseball fan, I think I don't hate the Giants as I did early on. But she also was a hard worker. Took good care of me. She would take me to museums and again kind of show and expose to me different parts of the community, different parts of the world. She had an eighth grade education, but is probably the smartest person I've ever met.
Mm. Wow, that's good. That's great. That's great to have those influences. I love those stories because that foundation, right, is you're not always set by your childhood and those influences, but they can certainly make a huge difference, and that seems to be a theme from people, that we talk to here. So eventually, you'll find your way to college and on to law school, but what was the path there? Because I mean, was education stressed in your house a lot, or did you just how'd you find your way to education being such a big part of your life?
It was a little bit of both. I was not a good student. I did have role models that showed the way through the education systems. My uncle, I have two uncles that graduated from college. One went to Harvard,
Mm,
very successful. Went to UCLA, then to Harvard, and his brother. I followed his brother's path at least initially, and that was I went to a community college and then to a state institution. So I did have those models that I could look up to, and I could see the advantages of the educational system. I was a very poor student. I try to keep that from my kids,
mm,
who two of them are out of college now, but one is a high school, and I don't let them know that I didn't do very well in
yeah.
high school as I'm pushing them. But yeah, I was a C student at best. And I had no plans to go to college really other than to play baseball.
Mhm.
I was an undersized right-handed pitcher, but loved the game and wanted to play it for as long as I could. And so I ended up going to a community college, Santa Monica College, and played there for 2 years. And again, I only went to college so I could play baseball. Something clicked in those 2 years where I understood what it was to be a student and what it was to prepare, what it was to get good grades. Part of it, I think, was finding a passion for certain subjects. I was a history major and I loved history.
Mhm.
So, some good professors, and I think just a combination of factors allowed me to understand what it was to be a good student. I went to Cal State Northridge from there. And when I graduated from there, I had this feeling, this that I wasn't done with school. I had just started to get the hang of it, and I wanted to do something else. And my path was to get a master's degree in history and become a teacher and baseball coach.
Mhm.
And somebody told me, I don't remember who it was, said, well, you seem to like history. You seem to not like the Constitution and the founding of our country. Why don't you take a look at law school? Because you can always do that. You can get a law degree and you can go back and teach and coach and do whatever you want. But then you have some optionality with the law degree. Um, uh, this was happening in the mid 80s, and mid to late 80s, I was a huge fan of a show called LA Law.
Oh yeah.
Big fan, loved LA
Yes.
Law.
Yes.
And Victor Cifuentes was kind of my
Yes.
idol back then. And, Puerto Rican lawyer, dressed nice, huge office, loved it. I kind of had those two things going in my mind. And I said, okay, I'll give law school a try. And I ended up going to Gonzaga. They made a very good offer, financial offer for me to attend. And that was the path towards my legal career.
Yeah. That's such a key pivot point in your career. I wonder what would have happened if that show never, one, if that show wasn't on, or if they didn't. What was that actor's name? Jimmy something,
Jimmy
Jimmy
Smits.
Smith?
Jimmy Smits.
Smiths. Yeah.
Smits.
What it was Smiths. What if they didn't cast him in that? Right. I mean, that's such a great example of how important that diversity was in that show.
Yeah.
It's much more common now to have diversity in shows, of course, but this is the mid '80s, and that's a real life story of how that had an impact on you. That's interesting.
Yeah, and it goes to my earlier point. If you have to see to be right, and
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
having that, seeing a Latino in that role, at the time I would say it probably was not at the forefront of my mind as I was thinking about law school. I know now, on hindsight, that it did have an influence on my decision to apply for law school.
So you go to law school, Gonzaga, you're not playing baseball at that point anymore. Given your love of sports and then melding that with law school, did you ever think you were going to go maybe the sports agent route? I'm just curious about that. Did that ever cross your mind? Especially you're in LA. There's a lot of them in LA.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the reasons I went to Gonzaga was they had a professor there named Jim McCurdy, and he was a co-author of the first sports law textbook,
Mm.
which I think was first published in the early 1980s. It was a textbook devoted to sports law, and he was a professor there. He taught there, and I thought, I'm going to go study under him, understand the rules of the road of sports law, and move back to LA and try to apply that, which an agent would be top of the list.
Mhm.
So I absolutely did consider that as I started my law school journey. I'm very competitive. I love to debate and to advocate, and I was drawn to litigation. I clerked at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Spokane while I was at Gonzaga. They have a Rule 9 internship program, which they still have in the state, that allows second and third year law students to actually get up in front of judges and try cases or argue motions. And I was just taken by it. I loved it. I loved the preparation. I loved the strategy. I loved trying to convince somebody of my position. And once I got that bug, I took off in a different direction.
Yeah. So you graduate from Gonzaga, and is that when you go to DC? You end up in DC, I know. Is that the leap you make at that point?
It was, yeah. I ended up at the Department of Justice and in a program called the Attorney General's Honors Program, which actually started after my second year as an intern and then moved on as an attorney. I was a trial lawyer in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice based in Washington, D.C. And I was in a section called the Housing and Civil Enforcement section. And that section is responsible for enforcing two or three different civil rights laws, the Fair Housing Act, so housing discrimination, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which is lending discrimination, and Title II of the Civil Rights Act, which is public accommodations, so hotels, bus stations, train stations, things like that. And I was drawn in particular to lending discrimination, and
Mm-hmm.
really it was at the forefront of using analytics to identify potential discriminatory practices and patterns by banks and mortgage companies. So I spent 6 years at the Justice Department. I did a number of different types of cases. I tried cases in Philadelphia, in Florida, and in LA. Did some work in Washington State. So I was able to travel the country. But what was instrumental there, a couple of things. One was the people I worked with. I was so intimidated when I went there. I was working with lawyers, probably 80% of them were Ivy League.
Hmm.
I was working for, with Harvard and, Princeton and so it was really intimidating coming from a junior college, state college in
Yeah.
Gonzaga, and walking down the halls there. So I had to fight that intimidation and that kind of sense I didn't belong. Um, and what I think that caused me to do even more than I had already done is over prepare. Compensate for that lack of confidence and believing I didn't belong by making sure I was prepared with everything I did. And that's something, no matter where you go to school, no matter what you do, you can always prepare as good, if not better, than anyone, no matter where they went to school. So I learned to prepare. The other thing, it really was my first exposure to finances, in particular the lending discrimination cases that we investigated. It caused me to go deep into understanding the consumer credit, commercial credit process, understanding how banks operate, financial institutions operate, and was really my first exposure to understanding the world of business, like what a board of directors is and what it does. So it was really instrumental and another level of foundation to my career.
And I think Janet Reno was the attorney general at that time, right? I think
She
I've heard you
was.
say she was a great leader. So what made her a great leader? What attributes did you recognize?
She was silent. She was a silent leader. She was not a chest pounder by any stretch of the imagination. I was in several meetings with her where she would listen intently at the people that were on her staff, including me at times, and would ask good questions to get information and would make a decision, largely, but not always, based on the recommendations of her staff. And I think that showed a type of leadership style that is maybe a little bit different when most people think of what a leader is. They think of a leader as being more forceful, outgoing, outspoken, directing and leading a team. That's not the way she operated. She trusted the people that she brought on. She trusted they would give her good information. And yes, the buck stopped with her. She made the decision, but she did it based on confidence that her staff had done the appropriate research and given her good recommendations. And I think you saw that publicly. She had a couple of public situations where she took some criticism, and she took the blame for that. She took the blame for making those decisions. And I know behind the scenes, she was relying on the recommendations of her staff. So just an incredible, thoughtful leader that showed a style that was something I was not accustomed to, and I think is a little bit different than what most people think as the stereotypical leader.
So this is a kid that was not a great student, right? Finds his way to law school, finds his way to DC. You're working with Janet Reno and these Ivy League, resumes. What skills were you picking up? Did you pick up along the way that allowed you to play in that arena? I mean, was it your writing skills? Did you become a good writer? What was it about you that changed, that helped you hold your own, right? Because clearly you went on to some even bigger things. But what was it along the way that you were picking up?
I've been told, and on the Briggs Myers and other tests that I've taken over the years, EQ,
Hmm.
that emotional intelligence and the ability to communicate effectively, to understand the situational awareness, I think has always been a key asset that I have had. I was, you mentioned writing. I was a horrible writer. I think I'm serviceable writer. I can remember it, but I had some amazing mentors at the Justice Department, and I remember One deputy that I reported to, in particular, Brian Heffernan, would spend probably hours editing my papers. Right. And this is the day before Word, spell check, right? And
Yeah,
certainly no
sure.
AI.
Yeah.
And so he would be behind his desk with a red pen, and he would say, Fred, come into my office. And he would hand me this brief that was just covered with red.
Yeah.
And I would study all of his corrections so I could get better, right? So I could understand where I was making mistakes. And most of them it was more grammatical. It was more stylistic, structure, as opposed to thinking. I think I have always been a pretty good thinker. But it was how to communicate effectively in writing. So I think of Brian and others who really trained me through showing all the errors that I made in my writing. But I think the EQ and the ability. I think your question actually is what I've utilized to gain any intelligence and move forward, and that is picking things up from people,
Mhm.
and that's both good and bad, right? It's picking up traits, characteristics, way of doing things that I have attached to myself and become part of who I am. And conversely, seeing things, seeing traits, seeing behaviors, I don't want to do that. That's not the way I want to operate. That's not the way I want to communicate. That's not the way I want to present myself or deal with other people. I've seen it both ways, and trying to combine everything I've picked up over the years to create who I am and how I go about my business. And now I'm on board of directors, and I'm a relatively newbie on boards, on for-profit boards, about 6 years worth of experience. And I love going into a board meeting just to see the more experienced board members around the table and how they engage.
Mhm.
I learn something every single meeting.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so much in there, Fred, that I have two teenage daughters, and so I think about these things, and it's listening skills, I think, is another big thing, is the observing that you're talking about, being a sponge, taking in what you observe, both the good and the bad, and then as a listener, being able to communicate. I think that's huge, and especially in many fields, but particularly at a time you are forced to practice it in a way because we didn't have the shortcuts of AI, and so I think you have to be more intentional about it today, to do that. But that you recognize that, I think is important. A lot of the good leaders, they're good listeners first, and observational. So it sounds like you had to make a choice though at one point. Like you can go down the DC route, the government route, right? Or you can go the private sector. And is that eventually you end up at Perkins Coie, which is a major law firm, and you were managing partner in Seattle for quite a while. Did you go from DC to that job?
I did, and it was, this is a stereotype of government lawyers, but at the time, and this is 1997, 1998, when I'm making this decision, and my colleagues of my vintage, we would talk and say, look, at around 5 years of DOJ practice, you have to make a decision. Am I going to be a lifelong government lawyer, or am I going to market the assets that you obtain as a government lawyer and take that on to private practice? After 6, 7, 8 years, you start to get a little stale, and it's a little bit more difficult. All these are stereotypes, but that's the conversations that I would have with my colleagues. And so at about that time, I thought, well, let me try private practice, right? If I don't like it, I can always move back or try to move back into government practice. And so where I ended up at Perkins Coie was a combination of regional preference. I wanted to move back to the West Coast. I had been in the state of Washington at Gonzaga, and I was very impressed with the Perkins Coie firm. I had knew them from Washington D.C. They had been pro bono counsel on some civil rights cases I had
Mm.
worked on. Was really impressed with the people that I met with, the culture of the organization, and so made that leap in 1998, moving into private practice at Perkins. Another part of it is, I asked them, they wanted me in the labor and employment group as a litigator, which didn't excite me that much. I didn't want to necessarily be defending labor and employment cases. And so, I asked him, I said, is there ability to develop my own practice and my own business within the firm? And they said, absolutely. You have the ability to use the resources, get your own clients, develop your own work. You're not going to be pigeonholed. And that they held to their word. And I was able to come in, and while the base of my practice was labor and employment, I went back to that financial services background I developed at the Justice Department, and started to develop a financial services practice representing banks and mortgage companies on either counseling or other matters.
So when you're back in Seattle, or you're to Seattle, you become, managing partner at one point. And I think just explain, what does that mean to people? Because you're the leader. So you're now the leader, so maybe some of those skills you learned from Janet Reno and others, now you're the guy out front. Um, but you're also practicing law and managing the firm, at least a local office. That seems like a full plate.
It was, and I backed off on my practice, so I had
All
enough
right.
time to work on the administrative management part of the office, and it was an interesting time at the firm. The firm was continuing to grow, including in the Seattle market, but especially outside the Seattle market. The Seattle is where the law firm was founded over 100 years ago. The firm actually incorporated Boeing,
Mhm.
filed its articles of incorporation. So a long history, and the center of the firm for many, many years. As the firm grew in Chicago and New York, that started to change a bit, or at least diversify with the firm. And so, when I was managing partner, we had about 325 lawyers, 1,000 or so staff in the Seattle area, and it was my job, I believe, not only to make sure that the copier machines ran, and the lights were turned
Right.
on, and oversee all of the fundamentals of operating a business, but also to make sure that our lawyers and staff understood the importance of the Perkins Coie name in our community, and came to work every day energized to represent that brand, to represent amazing companies. The client list was and is a who's who, from Microsoft and Amazon to Starbucks. And so I really spent a lot of time on culture, continuing the culture that had been developed over the decades in the Seattle office. Spent a lot of time with staff and associates in particular to communicate the importance of that, so the firm could continue that legacy in the Pacific Northwest. And that also included being very active in the community. I think the firm prides itself in its philanthropy, both monetarily, but also in resources of having partners on boards of various nonprofits. So you're right, it was a full plate. I spent a lot of time with all of the above during the 6 or 7 years that I was managing partner of the office.
Yeah, yeah, and that's been a part of your, advocacy, right? While you were in DC, and then your work with nonprofits is, a long list. You were talking about the clients there. One of the clients, I believe, was the Seattle Mariners.
Yeah.
So, and you did work for the Mariners while at Perkins, and that was the impetus to someone tapping you on the shoulder about stepping in at general counsel for the Mariners, I'm guessing.
It was, yeah. I did a little bit of litigation. I think the most exciting thing I did for the Mariners was player arbitration work.
Mhm.
So under MLB and the collective bargaining agreement, there's a process where certain players have the ability to challenge the salary offered by the team and move it to arbitration if it's a player with 3 to 5 years experience. Most of those arbitrations settle before going to hearing. One of those that did not was Freddie Garcia,
Oh
and
yeah.
I think it was 2000.
Mm.
And we went, unfortunately, went to arbitration with Freddie Garcia, a very accomplished pitcher. It's a process I'm glad I don't do anymore, because you literally sit in a room across the player, a small room. There's 3 arbitrators, and you put up statistics that show why he's really not that good.
Yeah, that's not a good conversation.
All right, and this is in February as they're about
Uh,
to report to spring training.
yeah,
So it's a really difficult process, but it was fun. I spent, weeks and weeks and weeks poring over statistics, comparable statistics of other pitchers and their salaries to make the argument where his salaries and not. So it was that experience, and my predecessor at the Mariners, his knowledge that I love baseball, and actually at that time I was playing in a senior league, so I was still playing at that time, and
oh, that's cool.
I think between those factors, he asked if
Yeah.
I was interested, and that kicked off an interview process.
Yeah. And so, you go to work for a major, major league baseball team. What was it like being part of such a public facing organization? Whereas, your neighbors, everyone you meet on the street, a lot of them have a emotional vested interest in that team. Now, I know you're not drafting players and things like that, but you are part of something that's very personal to people. Did you feel that? Did you get a sense of that from, the community?
Absolutely. And I think many of them didn't know whether or not I drafted players or had, given the stolen base sign the night before. Because
Yeah.
I think the perception is you're part of the Seattle Mariners. And in particular, if you're part of the executive team, you are the Mariners, right? So,
Mhm.
the passion is there. And I had always known, just going back to my grandmother, the passion that sports can create, right? People really care about it. And in the 8 years I was with the Mariners, I saw that firsthand, both the good and the bad. In every meeting I would go into, a board meeting, those would be the first comments that would be made to me, particularly in season, about how the team is doing, or do I think the team's going to make any moves? And that's because people really, really care.
Mhm.
And it also is it's a way that our community can unite around a topic that is regionally unique. They care about the Seattle Mariners or the Seahawks, even when they're griping about it, right? They complain about them because they care. So yeah, I saw it firsthand. People are emotional about it, and I was, and still am. People still talk to me, and I still
Yeah.
get texts because I'm still a special advisor there about the team and how they're doing. Right now, as we talk on August 4th, those texts are very positive. So we
Yes.
hope
Yeah.
that continues to be the case.
So you touched on something there that I talked to John Finkel, who wrote a book about the Sonics hoop heist, and we talked about this recently. And it was about when the Sonics were fighting with the city council before they left. There was a city councilman, Nick Licata, who was he said, the team has almost zero cultural value to the community. And that gets lost in the shuffle. I know there's a lot of blame on Howard Schultz and all that. I get it. But that sentiment just really bothers me to this day that, you know, we see what that means, what they meant because they're gone now. Right. And you're talking about, talk like your grandma, and that connection with the Dodgers. So those roots run deep, don't they?
They run really deep, and it's not unique to the United States, which really is
Uh-huh.
amazing. I've done some reading on Nelson Mandela, and he used sports
Yeah.
as a vehicle to unite the country post apartheid, and he has some beautiful quotes about the power of sports to inspire, to unite, to create a collective will that nothing else can. And he talks about the Springboks, which is the rugby league team back there, and so anyway, it's an international concept. The Olympics, right? That's all about uniting around sports, and sports is the vehicle. In the Pacific Northwest, I went through a similar battle with the county council in terms of stadiums, and this was
Yeah.
in 2008 when we were up for renewal of the lease at what was then Safeco, now T-Mobile Park, and we were requesting funds for capital upgrades at T-Mobile Park, which is county owned. The Mariners lease it, and was dealing with King County Council members on this. We were fortunate enough to get appropriate funding for probably about 25-30% of the capital improvements that are going to be necessary over the next few decades. But I said at the time, and I firmly believe that sports is part of the cultural fabric of a region. It's just as important as the arts. It's for employers who are trying to draw employees to this region. Towards the top of the list of livability is the sports environment. It creates revenue. All the teams employ thousands and thousands of people. The TV, the media exposure that it creates. If you think about the All-Star game in 23, the Winter Classic on NHL, those are internationally broadcast. And so it is really, really important and unites us in an important way. And last thing I'll say on that is just in terms of the venue. There's no other place in the Pacific Northwest where you're going to get 50,000 people together. In the case of the Seahawks, more than that, 70,000 in some cases, for one event over 2 or 3 hours together, shoulder to shoulder. Over 2 million a year, shoulder to shoulder. You don't know if you're sitting next to a lawyer or somebody who works for the city. And it's just a beautiful thing that I think we have to recognize the power sports has.
Yeah. I mean, you're high-fiving someone that might have completely different political views, right? I mean, different social economics, all of it. And it does bring people together. And I will tell you, and you know this, that when a team is, particularly when they're doing well, there is a buzz in the city. There's a buzz at work. In my office, it's a day game. People are hanging around the TV, watching to see what happened. I was at an event yesterday, a Sunday event, and there was a TV. The Mariners were playing the Rangers. People were gathering around. They wanted to see what was going on at the end of the game, and it binds us. So I don't think many people would argue at this point that it doesn't, but there is an investment that cities have to make. And I think, we're learning they would do that. But sports is such a big business now. And before we move on to that, I just wanted to ask about your role with the Mariners. Did you spend your time, like, were you working on player contracts at that point, or was it more about like naming rights and things like that as a general counsel?
Yeah, it was mostly it was a lot of external work, and so it was a tough decision to leave Perkins Coie. I loved the firm, loved the job of managing partner. The reason, one of the main reasons I left, in addition to it really being a passion play, was the assignment and priorities that I was asked to focus on when I came in. And they were largely threefold. One was the lease. The lease was coming up, and so make sure we get a long-term lease to ensure the Mariners remain in Seattle for generations to come. The second was to take a hard look at the community engagement, particularly through the foundation of the Seattle Mariners, and how can we engage with the community in a more meaningful way, including focusing on the younger generation of baseball, softball, and sports fans in general. How can we create that passion, that desire, and get kids out to play, right? It's so important to get kids out to play, whether it's baseball, softball, whatever it is, soccer. And so that was very instrumental in why I took the job, was to take a look at that, how the Mariners could engage in the community. And then another area I was asked to focus on was real estate development around T-Mobile Park. SoDo has had its challenges over the years, particularly post-COVID. And so how could the Mariners participate in revitalizing, or vitalizing in the first place, that area around the ballpark to create a welcoming environment that creates jobs, that's inviting to the fans who attend games. And so I spent a lot of time on those issues, in addition to more traditional general counsel roles, uh, mostly commercial contracts. We did have the T-Mobile naming rights deal while I was there. Media also became a huge part of my portfolio. The Mariners are one of a handful of teams and who have an interest in their regional sports network, and the only team who owns 100% of their RSN. So I ended up spending a lot of time on Root Sports and the Mariners' ownership of that business.
On the real estate side of things, in development, I mean, you're seeing entertainment districts in cities, right? I mean, I'm sure you studied them, but like LA Live, which was a big hit initially, downtown LA is, had its issues, but I know there's other cities, I think Denver, and you know many more of them than I do. But that's really what you're seeing. Is that still happening now, this development of sports and entertainment districts where all these venues are really starting to tie in together with retail, restaurants, hotels, things like that?
Absolutely, and it's international. So some of the soccer, football, European football stadiums are very aggressively creating these stadium districts or entertainment districts that are tied to the experience of the game. Nationally, it is as well, particularly for new stadiums that are being built. It's not just the footprint of the stadium, it's also what's around it. Colleges, you're seeing more colleges investing in businesses that surround the stadium. And it makes sense because you draw so many people into that facility to see a game, to see an event. It makes perfect sense. Once they're there, there's other things that they want to do. And in the case of a Denver, as an example, they're one of many. It also includes residential housing. So you're creating, instead of the old school style of Wrigley Field or Ebbets Field or the old New York stadiums, where you're building in an existing residential environment. Now they're bringing the residential environment to an existing stadium to create this density in a very thoughtful way. So that's a trend, as far as I'm concerned, that we're going to see for a number of years.
Yeah, and we started touching on how big sports is, right? I mean, media rights, these contracts players have, real estate, it all ties in together because it matters to people. They're willing to pay for it and go to it because they get something for it. You mentioned, I think, an advisor to the Mariners now. You've started the Rivera Group, and you're still involved in sports and business. And I think one of the things you're involved with is the understanding of fractional ownerships in teams, correct? Could you explain that a little bit? Because we are starting to see that on a bigger scale with private equity and venture capital. But what is that? What is your role in that world now?
So I started the Rivera Group in March, sports advisory firm focusing on supporting investors, either who are interested in investing in sports properties, franchises, teams, or adjacent businesses, which could include real estate development, and also supporting essentially fundraising for general partners who are going to buy a team, have bought the team, and are looking for limited partners to join that business. So I think the fractional ownership, you see it in two ways. One, you have established ownership groups who are looking to add additional capital into the business. That additional capital could be for player payroll. It could be for capital improvements at a stadium or at a real estate development. It could be for a number of different things. And so they're issuing new equity to new partners to join the partnership. Sometimes that's an individual or a set of individuals. And more, we're seeing private equity come in as that additional equity investor. Most, if not all, of the major five leagues, NBA, NFL, MLB, have restrictions and guidelines on private equity investment in sports teams. There are limits between 5 and 10% maximum investment. limits in the number of teams one private equity firm can have in multiple teams within a league. And private equity firms, the big ones, Arctos, Redbird Capital, Silver Lake, a number of others, are coming in to bring that equity into an existing team, but also bring the expertise that they have in the industry, really around innovation, ranging from the use of AI, how to maximize sponsorship sales or media, how to consolidate operations to streamline and maximize operations. So that's one area that you're seeing the infusion of fractional ownership, private equity. The other is just buying teams, and that is having a general partner that is raising funds to buy a team, and that can include limited partners that are additional private equity companies or individuals. What I'm, and you're also seeing more willing investors. I think it's investing in a sports franchise is near the top of the list of alternative investment strategies. It's market agnostic. Last week, the Dow and S&P took a pretty big tumble. That didn't affect the value of sports teams last week, right? Sports teams remain scarce, and so their value will continue to grow. And investors and family offices see the value of diversifying their investment, including in sports teams. One thing I think is really exciting is the use of special purpose vehicles, SPVs, to get small investors into teams. I've seen investments as low as $1,000 into an SVP to be part of an ownership in a team. And that really allows additional investors or fans to come in and participate. I think the Green Bay Packers were ahead of their time when they actually took their business public to own an interest in the Green Bay Packers. I think we're going to continue to see that not only in the public market, but in the private market as well.
And this is global, right? I mean, you're seeing this. I mean, this is not just the 4 or 5 major leagues we're talking about in the U.S. I mean, it's obviously you see it in European soccer and Mexican soccer teams and even the minor leagues, perhaps. I mean, it's. I think we're just scratching the surface on this, particularly the smaller fractional ownership potentially.
Absolutely. And you're also seeing it in different sports outside of the big 5 leagues. Rugby, lacrosse is off to a really good start. Really exciting what is happening with women's sports. The WNBA continues to grow. Women's hockey is growing. This year, there's a new women's baseball league. So there's just, and all of that is being seeded by capital from investors who understand, going back to the power of sports to unite. It's a really exciting time in sports.
And so, and just to be clear, so let's say you're a small investor, you put in $10,000 or something. You're not going to have any control. You're not going to, you're not voting on the payroll and whatnot. And it's very passive, right? You're not going to decide when the liquidity could be an issue. I mean, there's going to be rules applied to it.
That's right. I mean,
right?
In general, the general structure is you have a general partner / managing partner, and that will be the entity that controls the business, controls the team. The limited partnership group is going to be the passive. Now, they do have certain rights. If you're in a special purpose vehicle, those rights will be assigned to somebody who is the head of that SPV. But yeah, these smaller investments are in the limited partnership area. But you still get to participate in any gain. So if the team sells in 7 years at 6 times what you invested, you will enjoy the benefits of that investment. You get to say you own a part of a team and carry the flag for that team as well.
Yeah. I think a lot of people will be interested in that, and I think it's becoming more of a vehicle, like you mentioned. Looking back at all of these things, Fred, do you have an appreciation for, I guess, what you didn't know when you were a kid, when you're working with your grandpa, and can you look back at that now and say, you were learning. You may not have realized it, but you were learning along the way, and it's paid off throughout your life and your career here.
Yeah, I mean, I think for all of us, every experience is a learning, right? Whether it's positive or negative, whether it's observing the challenges of others, absolutely, I think about learning the value of hard work when I worked with him and observing him work really hard and observing how he managed a business. And I think as I mentioned this before, as I think back about him in particular, he had probably 30 to 40 clients that he had to manage, and he did it on a little scrap of paper. Right? But
Uh-huh.
he still needed to keep his books. He needed to make sure that he got paid. He needed to have a schedule to go out to, and he was grinding to get that done with no formal education whatsoever. And so to be able to observe that really on hindsight, to understand what it is to run a business, what it is to get a client, right? To get in the first place a client to say, yes, you can come into my house, into my backyard in an intimate space and landscape and take care of my yard. There are some skills to that. There are some people skills to that. There's a developing trust. And so I think all of the experiences, whether it was as a kid at the Justice Department, in law school and high school, friends, colleagues have all been part of a learning experience. And I'm at a point in my career where I can kind of step back a little bit and think about those things, right? And think about what I have learned and how I can apply them to the next stage of my career.
Was there points along the way, perhaps finishing law school, that you were able to share with your parents and your grandparents, if they were still alive at that time? Were you able to celebrate these milestones with them?
Tried a little bit. Hindsight, I probably should have done a little bit better. I think it was uh, for particularly my grandparents. My grandmother was alive. It was from her perspective, it was the understanding that I had completed an educational step. I think what happened next, going back to C to B, she didn't know what it meant after that. She
Uh-huh.
understood the diploma. She understood graduating. That was very understandable. What happened after that was not. So, definitely they knew what I was doing. I wish I would, like so many of us, I think in hindsight, would have expressed the appreciation and the value that I got from them. But I'm happy to know that she was able at least to see what I had obtained educationally and what I started to accomplish.
And what about with your kids? You have three kids, and do you, along the way, did you talk to them about your grandparents? And you know they your kids probably had a different upbringing than you had, and do you talk to them about that?
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. They know they know and probably are tired of me hearing tired of hearing from me.
Mm.
That's not only the way my grandparents lived and the way I was brought up, but what how I was raised. And somebody asked me the other day what my first job was, and I had to think about it. And I said, well, I think I was 10 years old. My uncle lived in Chula Vista, California, and had a beautiful avocado tree in his backyard. And I used to go visit him frequently, and I would go down there with a couple boxes, and I would bring back avocados, and then I would put them in a basket, and I would go door to door around the neighborhood, and I would sell them. Uh, and so,
Yeah.
and so I said, I guess around 10 years old is when I started working. I worked at a swap meet, which are kind of big in Southern California,
Yeah.
selling T-shirts. So yeah, anytime not anytime, but uh, probably more times than they would like when they ask me for something or they're complaining about something, I will remind them of those experiences, hoping to ground them, to level them, and to have them appreciate what they have.
Yeah, it's important. I mean, they may act like, you know, it's, like water off a duck's back, but they pick up on little things like that, and I do think it's important to remember that and to challenge them with, their own responsibilities and to learn. Again, that's the sponge part, right? Observing, listening that we've been talking about. Um, so if people want to learn more about you, perhaps some of these sports ownership opportunities and things like that, is that your website? Is that the best place to find you?
It's a good start. Yeah. Rivera Group LLC.com has information about the services that I'm offering. Also has links to some other interviews I've done, and this will go up on it as well. And there's information on how to contact me as well.
Yeah. Well, look, we love stories. Your story is a combination of baseball, grandparents, LA law, all these components come together to shape what has really been a fabulous career, and you're still going. You're in this new chapter. And I think people can glean a lot from that, Fred. So thanks for being here today, and I appreciate you sharing your story.
Thank you, Greg. I appreciate the invitation, and I enjoyed our time together.